Um, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to those of you that have joined us for the first time and to those of you that are returning participants. I'm Ali Gill and I'm hosting the webinar today and with Patrick Dunne. So I can't remember which number we're on now. Is this number 6, Patrick?
I think it's number 5.
Okay, right. So same sort of format really. The purpose of this webinar is for us, Patrick and I have been working away with boards during the pandemic and both from the point of view of sitting on boards and working with boards to help them maintain their effectiveness through the crisis. And this is really a webinar to help us share our experiences just for the purposes of sharing knowledge and learning and just really discussing some of the topics that boards are finding challenging or actually are really enjoying. And just thinking a little bit forward about what boards can do to be more effective as time progresses on through this current crisis. Things are hotting up at the moment, and definitely seeing a lot more organisations sadly having to make people redundant. Also seeing some really interesting innovations, I think, particularly in the tech sector. So some really interesting things for us to discuss today, Patrick. Just to remind everybody, if you want to ask questions as we go, please do. If you can try and use the Q&A function, then we can record those questions, or the chat function. But the Q&A is great if you can do, because then if we don't get to answer anything, we can make sure we follow up with that online. So Patrick, we were going to start this morning having a little bit of a thought about stakeholders. Obviously, I think the pandemic has really sort of highlighted the need for boards to think much more broadly about who their stakeholders are and what we mean by stakeholders. What's your position on
that? It's been developing, I think, over the while, and I think the first thing is being clear who your stakeholders are and what a stakeholder means, and I suppose in the context of a board, trying to deliver for all of those people who have an interest in what you're doing. With a lot of boards I've helped through transition, sometimes the reason for me getting involved has been they've got a real problem with one of the stakeholders. That could be their shareholders, it could be a regulator, it could be the staff, it could be following a takeover, something like that. So, and what's always amused me has been when I ask that question, have you got a stakeholder strategy? And you get that sort of blank look. So there was one situation where a company had a serious problems with its regulator, and it had got itself into sort of victim mode. And I asked the question at the board, well, kind of, where do you want to be with the regulator? Do you want to be, top of the class, the industry sort of best viewed by the regulator, the industry performer best viewed by the regulator, or do you want to be on the naughty step? Or do you want to be sort of comfortably, quietly in the middle, not getting much attention, but delivering all that you can, but not having to put a lot of effort in? And they said, well, that's really interesting. We never really thought about that. So I think if you take any stakeholder group, so I always remember being, I was on the Warwick University board, that, the local councils and the local people are incredibly important stakeholders for the university, and having a clear strategy about how you're going to manage relationships with the community, what are your objectives, how do you deal with it, is really quite important. Also, I think there's something around the issue of, do you really know what people think of you? And lots of times we make assumptions because we think rationally, well, this will be good for that group. It's clearly in their best interest, therefore we'll do that. But we don't always test that and test whether actually really they do value that in the same way that they think they will. So there's something around that too, around in terms of putting together a decent stakeholder strategy. And then obviously, it's really important to know where you are with your stakeholders, but really important then to track as time progresses. And I think it's not an area where it's not an area often where people really put the emphasis on until they have an issue, until one of them gets grumbly. or one of them sort of, can actually prevent you doing something you want to do. So that would be my sort of initial thought around stakeholder strategy.
And have you, how have you, with the boards that you sit on, how do you go about developing a stakeholder strategy? And has that changed at all during the crisis?
Yes, because I think over time, you want to have a sort of nice balance between, all stakeholders feeling good about you, all stakeholders well looked after. But clearly, the times that we've been in, we've probably, as most boards, have probably prioritised the health and well-being of staff and the people that you deal with has been the number one priority, and maybe de-emphasised shareholders in a sense in terms of return, because in order to keep people alive, you've had to sacrifice, you have to spend money and all the rest of it. And it's the board's job to achieve that balance. The other thing I think is giving clear accountability and responsibility. So I always remember on the whiteboard again, the different important strategic relationships were carved up between the board. So, one or two or three people would focus on these particular aspects. Other board members would focus on those other groups. In smaller organisations, I think, you might just have, you might apply the same approach, but it may well be less sophisticated, less well resourced. So in terms of, I remember at 3i, when I took over as marketing director, I wanted to know what people thought of us in very different groups. Some groups we had really good tracking data, other groups we had no idea. So you have to invest a bit to get that tracking, but it was really illuminating.
I mean, there's a key thing at the moment, isn't there, around the employees becoming, I guess, more front of mind in terms of safety and health and well-being, and I wonder to what extent boards are really thinking about that being something that they need to continue doing as we come out of the pandemic, or whether actually it'll just return to kind of what was normal beforehand.
It'll be highly variable, and you'd like to think every director was thinking about making sure people were safe and well. But I think the well-being goes beyond the sort of hygiene factor of health and safety law and so on. And I think it's interesting. Again, we've talked frequently on these webinars about how people feel about the organisation, and I think it's been easier for companies making hard decisions, making people redundant, if the staff generally feel they've been looked after, and actually it's not the company's making a decision because it has to, because of its financial position, or just capacity is no longer required that was before. I think you're more likely to get still sadness, but you'll get more sort of appreciation of why you're having to take the decision if you've done those other things. So, I mean, personally, I think it's just part of being a good company, and it will be good at attracting people.
Yeah. I mean, it sort of leads us in a little bit to the topic of culture, doesn't it? Because obviously, I mean, doing a bit of work with a board at the moment where they are really concerned about thinking about the changes that this situation is having on the culture of the organisation. So I think this particular organisation, financial services organisation, dealt with the pandemic very well early on, got very close, I think, to their employees, understood a lot about what people were feeling. Now having to make some changes, seeing that their product base is going to have to change, the way they're working is having to change, and I've started to think about what's the board's role in really oversight of the culture in this situation.
I suppose it's like in other areas. I mean, the board should be thinking about what's the culture that you want, knowing what culture you've got, and deciding to do things that will actually get you from the culture you've got to the one that you want, if there's any difference between those two things. I think the other thing that's changing is also, I think when people thought about culture, they thought about it sort of internally. They thought about engagement surveys. And I think there's a lot more data, a lot more kind of bits of information that you can use as a board to really help, understand what the culture actually is. And the other thing is, I think culture is so critical when recruiting people, and you should really only add people who are going to be additive to the culture to create the culture that you want. Not that you want to create clones, because part of the culture you want is to be diverse, so you don't want everybody to be the same. I think also investors are starting to flex their muscles a bit more around culture. I mean, there was the the work done by the FRC around culture, and at the beginning people going, what do they know about this? Why are they poking around on this? And then all of a sudden, I saw at the weekend that BlackRock have in the last few months voted against 53 boards re-election of directors on the basis that they haven't done what they think they should do on climate change, for example. So I think those votes from BlackRock against the re-election of directors will start to change the mindset, will start to change the culture, not just in those companies, but also in other companies. So I think there's a sort of lot of things that go into producing the cocktail that's called culture, from your own views on what you think it should be, what other stakeholders, going back to what we were talking before, think it should be, and actually what the staff want.
Yeah, and I think there is, there's probably a lot more sophistication around in terms of how you measure culture and what is culture, because obviously people talk about culture but as this sort of nebulous thing, but obviously culture is experience. It's what you experience in an organization, it's not what you talk about, and behavior really is what delivers culture. So how people behave drives the experience that employees have, drives the experience that customers have, drives and delivers the culture. So being clear about the kind of behavioural aspects of an organisation is really important. I think that's where the board can add, real value by getting very close to their employee base and understanding what that experience is in terms of working for the organisation.
Yeah, but I think that's absolutely spot on. But I think it also matters, and we've seen this through the crisis. It matters on the, one aspect of culture is the culture that you have with your suppliers or your customers. And I think the organisations that have treated their suppliers well through this, I suspect are the ones that, those suppliers are going to bring their best ideas to. The ones that have been really harsh with them, inconsiderate, less than thoughtful, probably aren't going to be the ones that are going to get the best prizes or the best ideas as you come out. So I think with any company or organisation, you have to think about where it sits with all these other things it interacts with. For my mathematician friends, the sort of set theory of all that's really quite entertaining and interesting, but it's very challenging.
Yeah.
And we all admire focus and we all admire single-mindedness, but actually I think one of the things that the crisis has demonstrated is that sometimes single-mindedness is totally inappropriate. You have to have a number of parallel sort of groups going on in your mind to make sure that you haven't really forgotten about this group over there that you shouldn't, or that will cause you damage later.
Yeah, that's a good point, isn't it? Because you think almost like the crisis is a sort of live experiment, really, which we're all going through. So if you apply that kind of mindset of, we don't really know the answer to this, who can help us figure out what to do? How can we collaborate with the suppliers that we have? How can we bring our employees on board to get the best of their possible ideas? I notice here we've got a question from Thomas, which is sort of linked to what I'm saying around, hasn't health and safety traditionally been more about safety, whereas now health and specifically mental health has come to the fore? And I think that's right, that what the pandemic has done for a lot of boards is opened up their mind, or is having to, is causing boards to open up their minds much more explicitly about the parts of their stakeholders that they haven't perhaps paid attention to. Yeah.
I mean, I'll give you a great example today. I was so excited this morning because it's the first day that the Y Foundation is doing virtual work experience. Now, who'd have thought? But actually, virtual work experience is now real work experience. Um, and that came about because, we were frustrated that we wouldn't be able to do the physical work experiences that we have with the young people in the programs. We talked to some of our corporate partners, who it might be easy to forget, but they're the people who will give these young people proper paid structured work experience, and said, how about we do this? We had to do some other things. We had to get more laptops, more broadband connectivity. The digital divide is really shocking in this country. All sorts of people we had to sort of around our sort of various stakeholder groups to enlist in this. But today, we've got, I think, 250 young people who wouldn't have had any work experience now going to get it. And it's a very uplifting kind of thing, really.
Yeah.
But a lot of people from different aspects had to get involved. To go back to Thomas's question, though, I think that's spot on. I think it was very focused around safety and risk mitigation. I also think the debate on well-being has only started, really. And again, I think it's focused on risk mitigation as opposed to maximizing opportunity. So, if you read Why We Sleep, or you read other books around the linkage between well-being and performance, and you think about the analogy with sport, you wouldn't put a Premier League player or a top athlete or a leading netball player into a game when they were absolutely exhausted, scared, and all those things, and expect them to deliver sort of Olympic standard performance. But it's interesting, many board members have been absolutely shattered, full of anxiety when they've been having to take some really big decisions. So, and the same goes for people throughout the organisation. So I think well-being, I think the discussion on this will change, and it might become more about well-being in the context of maximising performance rather than the dealing with poor well-being as a consequence of poor thinking or poor attention to it before.
I mean, there's so much more information available now, isn't there, about about how to look after mental health. There's a very interesting organisation called 6 Seconds. I don't know if you've come across them. They specialise in 6seconds.org. They specialise in emotional intelligence, and really doing a lot to help people think about what does it mean to be emotionally intelligent. Emotional intelligence being a key driver of making effective decisions, being a key driver of mental health and well-being, being a key driver of being in charge and controlling your emotions, which we know is so important in terms of mental well-being. So these sort of new skills, you mentioned Why We Sleep, one of my favourite books, because now I have every excuse to demand 8 hours sleep a night. The research in, I can't remember the author's name, Walker, isn't it? I think. Is it? You've probably got it on your shelf somewhere.
I've got it here somewhere. Matthew Walker, Why We Sleep.
Recommend it to everyone who has. If you haven't read it, please do read it. It's a really fantastic journey through some of the things that we now know about the importance of sleep, and change my behaviour. Definitely stop drinking coffee and tea after 5 p.m. Now that I understand the half-life of a cup of coffee is 7 hours.
Well, I wondered what it was, Ali, so now I know. That's great.
We're talking a little bit about mental health and well-being, and as you say, I think a lot of organisations have invested quite a bit of money, but I still think it's something that organisations are not really thinking about very cleverly in terms of changing workplace practices. What about some of the other areas that have come to the fore in the last few months? I mean, obviously we've talked before about Black Lives Matter, and I know you published an article yesterday, Patrick, on disability. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where I think we'll look back in, I don't know when, 5 years or so, or in the future, and we'll think, why the hell didn't we think about that? Why the hell didn't we do something about that? That's so unjust, so morally wrong, and so missing a large group of people who could really, you know, give us different insights and create more performance. And the point was, I was struck by seeing some data that 19% of the working age population have some form of disability. You know, it could be blind, could be physically impaired, other things. And then I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder how many FTSE 350 directors are disabled. And I tried to find the data, and I couldn't find it. And I thought it's either my hopeless sort of research skills, or it's not there. And it doesn't seem to be there. And so I thought, because despite my encouragement for people to get lots of sleep, I seem unable to follow this advice myself. So I was sort of bored in my twilight zone the other night and started looking at FTSE 350 board things on the web, and stopped at 100 because I couldn't find any reference. Anyway, I'm sure there would have been some disability, but no reference to anyone, or no obvious clue. And I thought, this doesn't seem strange. So I wrote this LinkedIn article. It's on my LinkedIn page if you're interested. And it's basically saying, you know, that the disability blind spot is disabling boards. I think we're missing out on a load of talent. And when you think of some of the amazing things that people have done as a result of getting disability. I mean, I found this guy, Mike Newman, who is the world land speed record holder for driving a racing car, and he's blind. You know, he drives this racing car around a track at 200 miles an hour. I mean, that's an incredible achievement. I mean, imagine what other things are possible. Interestingly, I don't know, but it works. He has a co-driver. But I mean, even so, that's pretty amazing, isn't it? But what's been striking, actually, so normally when I do a LinkedIn article, even on a Saturday, I might get 1,000 kind of views by sort of lunchtime today. This one had 45. Now, one of my friends said, well, you idiot, you shouldn't have put disability in the title, because then people would have clicked through. Isn't that really interesting? That we just seem to sort of think it's about another world. The other thing I discovered this morning, so someone who did see it emailed me to say, well, you know, have you not heard of the valuable 500? I mean, no. But the valuable 500 is a group of people. It has a chair, Paul Polman, you know, one of the most well-known CEOs you can sort of imagine. And they're signing up 500 leading CEOs. They're about halfway there. So if you're a CEO on the call and you think this is interesting, check it out. But all they want to do, they don't have massive aspirations, these guys. They just want to put disability on the agenda, start talking about it. So I think that's, I mean, it's interesting. I'm not disabled. I don't have any disabled family members, although my mum's going blind, sadly. But you just think that's not right, is it? That can't be right. We should do something about that. So I've made a call actually for someone who's in a position of greater influence than me to sort of try and pick this up and do something about it.
Yeah. I wonder. I'm wondering how many people on the call have an active policy to achieve better diversity with regards to some form of disability. I don't know, Leslie, whether you could just put that poll up and let's see out of the participants that we've got on, whether it's a topic on in the minds of the boards of the people on the call. So does your board have an active policy to achieve better diversity? We sadly can't vote. It's very. Do you have a view on why it's not a topic?
I do, and there's another book I'm reading at the moment which is really interesting called Dark Data. I don't know if you've heard of this book, but it's about when we make decisions, it's the stuff that we didn't know. You know, we might have liked to have known it, but we didn't have the data available, or we just didn't even think about it. And I think it's in that latter category. I just think we don't think about it because there are so few. We don't come across disabled board members, so we don't even see them experiencing how difficult it is to, you know, just get around a board table, for example. I mean, how many board tables are wheelchair friendly? That kind of, we do, because there aren't so many disabled people, we don't actually see it. I mean, 75% don't have that. So we won't be polling for polling's sake. But if you're a non-exec, there's a good question for your next board meeting. You know, why haven't we got a policy on that?
Yeah. And perhaps we can poll that in a few weeks' time, or maybe a couple of months' time, to see whether there is a greater awareness around. But I guess it's about diversity at a board level. It's about creating an environment which disability is not seen as a barrier to progress, isn't it? And brings me really to the sort of thought about inclusion. You know, how do you go about ensuring that you have an inclusive board, and also that you are thinking very much about inclusion within the organisation? Because of course, diversity is really about numbers, isn't it?
Yeah. So diversity is sort of, you know, what's the demographic of the board or the organisation, but inclusiveness is what's the approach to having you know, a diverse and inclusive culture. Because statistically, you know, if you've got a board of 7, it's actually very difficult to have, you know, just everyone who you might want to have from every sort of aspect of life. But that doesn't mean that you're not inclusive in your approach. And it's a bit like the difference between just being open-minded, where, you know, I'm open-minded if I'm prepared to change my view on the basis of someone giving me some information that might, you know, lead to a different rational choice. But I'm actively open-minded if I go out and seek that information, if I go out and try and find that. So, you know, we might not have a disabled person on our board, for example, but, you know, it's probably the case that a large number of our customers are disabled. So can we get their inputs in other ways? And then next time we're thinking about, you know, a board, and actually we may come onto this, you know, because I think there's a lot of churn happening in boards at the moment. You know, the next time we come to replace someone, you know, how accessible are we to disabled board members? So the other group, if I get a moment later this week, I'm going to poke around and see what they think are the search firms. I mean, you know, if you go back to 2003, you know, I think there were very few shortlists that had women on them for non-execs. If you go back just a very little while, there were very few shortlists which had any ethnic minorities on them. And, you know, now we can ask that question. So I think it's not an easy subject, and it's an uncomfortable subject in some ways. And the statistics, you know, if you boards, you ideally don't want them to be too big. So you can't have a representative board, and a representative boards probably aren't good ideas anyway, just in terms of people just representing a particular group or a particular point of view. But you want to have a diverse board and an inclusive culture. So it's back to culture again. So, you know, a question I would ask in terms of, do you know where your culture is? You know, ask that question. How inclusive really are you? Is it really an inclusive culture? You know, when I first got my job in the city, it didn't feel inclusive to Scousers. It really didn't. It really didn't feel inclusive to anyone who hadn't been to public school. All of those things. You know, it's not a dreadful hardship, but it's true. It was not. It was not an inclusive place.
Well, I can assure you, when I started working in the city, it very definitely wasn't inclusive for women. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think women and Scousers are probably on the same level. Scouse women must have had a hell of a challenge.
A couple of interesting comments. So, John, thank you. other than gender, do FTSE 500 company boards have any other significant diversity? Well, I think Patrick was sort of talking about the stats there. You're nodding, Patrick. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think actually probably the top 500. So they tend to be very international businesses, so almost that will help drive it. But also, I know from EY, as many of you know, I chair the EY Foundation. EY has been a real leader in this. I'm not an EY employee. I just the independent chair of the foundation, but I've seen that, and interestingly. You know, we're working on some race commitments at the moment, and we've really beaten ourselves up at the UI Foundation over. You know, we have 80% of our cohorts who are Black and Asian minority ethnic groups. You know, we've got a relatively small board, so we're fine in terms of BAME representation on the board, but we haven't got enough Black people on our board. We have had half our patrons are Black as well, but at the moment, you know, our BAME representation on the board is mostly Asian, and also we noticed that if you take the subcommittees, you know, audit and risk, nominations, and so on. Actually, most of the people who were chairing those were white, and we did do that deliberately. That's just how it happened. Interestingly, one of my Asian colleagues on the board said, you know, thank goodness all the white men and women are doing the boring stuff. We're doing the interesting stuff. But I don't think that's really the right answer. I think, you know, we need to change that. We've had 3 chairs of our youth advisory board who've been Black. We've currently got one who's white. That's the first one. But at that moment, if you look at that picture, you know, that's people will criticise that, and I can understand why. But it doesn't represent the track. So I think the organisations that really I think are good at this, talk about it, are actually open about it, and all will admit they're not ideally where they'd like to be at any one moment in time, despite their best efforts.
Mm. There's a really interesting test that you can do if you go to Harvard and look on their website. You can search for it. There's a big research project going on, and they are looking at different types of biases. So you can plug in a topic that you want to be tested on. So is it gender? Do you want to look at your gender bias? Do you want to look at your BAME bias? Do you want to look at your ethnic minority bias? And you get asked a sequence of questions. It's really worth doing. Really, really fascinating, because of course we all have unconscious bias. You know, our brains are programmed absolutely to be biased towards people like ourselves. That's part of how we've evolved. I'm interested in the comment from Tram here.
Yeah, I thought that was great. Yeah.
Autism and Asperger's a disability. I never quite know how to answer that question, because it can be profoundly disabling for people, but also profoundly empowering for.
Yeah, so I think the way that I would think of it, so there's a spectrum. So if you take the autistic spectrum, and if you take Asperger's, then there's high functioning Aspergic people and there's low functioning Aspergic people, and many people are Aspergic and function exceptionally well at some things and poorly at others. So the classic sort of Aspergic kind of image that people have is Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory, you know, an absolutely genius mathematically, socially, you know, awkward, and not terribly self-aware on some things, but incredibly self-aware on others, asymmetric sensitivity, all sorts of things going on. And I think, you know, that there are characteristics of being Aspergic, but not all Aspergics have the same set. So I think it is quite difficult. But the power of concentration that many Aspergic people have, their attention to detail, their memory. So my eldest son is Aspergic. He's a research scientist at Imperial. He's working on he's worked at CERN, working on dark matter and antimatter and all that stuff, and his memory is just astonishing. And those talents, actually, which when you're a child, people will, bully you, take the mick out of you, become incredibly useful in other settings. I love having Asperger people on the boards I'm on. I think I think they can add huge amounts, and you have to be aware and help them with the things that they find more difficult and more uncomfortable, just as with anyone else.
Mm. And I think the chair of the IOD, Charlotte Valeur, she's, I think, autistic, I'm sure, and speaks very profoundly, and has an autistic child, about actually how she feels it's helped her in chairing the board, because she believes that her sort of geeky interest in reading about corporate governance gave her a very clear frame of how she should chair an organisation. And throughout her life, she's used that autistic desire to be in the detail of something to be really helpful. And clearly she's had people around her who've helped her succeed despite her autism, and has used that autism as a strength. And I think, as you're saying, it's about creating that environment where people can flourish regardless, and putting people into roles where that it's not a disability, actually, in the particular roles. And it seems like, Tram, you're doing some great work there around identifying people who can help your organisation. There's another comment here from Georgina, similar experience about posting about Black Lives Matter, and people feeling they can't show support. Yeah. And I think this is really an important role for the board, isn't it, to be asking these questions and challenging thinking around some of these more difficult topics that can feel as if there is no easy answer. So, we started off talking about climate change and investors, BlackRock, starting to challenge board directors who are not taking up their responsibility around climate change. And we have mentioned here Chapter Zero before as an organisation that offers very useful tools for board directors. So I think some of these difficult to grasp topics in diversity, disability, BAME, diversity, are things, mental health, are things which boards really, board directors are really doing their job if they get these things on the agenda.
I think, the other thing is around tolerance. I think, often that's an asymmetric thing. We always want people to be far more tolerant towards us than we are to other people. But also, I think our tolerance to people who can't add up is incredibly high. When adding up matters quite a lot if you're on a board. And so it's really interesting. One of my sort of friends, we were joking about this the other day, because we both know someone who's actually a fantastically likable guy, so charming, so deft, always has a witty bon mot for anyone, but he can't add up to save his life. And you give him a board pack and he's lost with the numbers. He's got good instincts. He's very good at lots of things. I'm not saying he shouldn't be on a board, but he really, really shouldn't be on an audit and risk committee. He really shouldn't. And I think it's interesting. Whereas there's someone else on this board who's a bit sort of awkward, gangly in his language, not very, his antennae are a bit wonky from time to time, but you give him a complex set of information and data and he has it like that. He knows exactly what the issue is, and he finds it hard then to get attention for it in a meeting. And, if I were his chair, I'd be thinking, I love guys like that, people like that, because, if you can spot and listen to them and listen carefully to them, you'd probably save yourself a lot of money and make yourself a lot more.
There is, I think there often is a challenge. We can often find when we're doing board reviews that if you've got someone on the board who is a bit awkward, but actually very data centric, very good at doing data analytics, maybe a little bit socially awkward too, there's often there's a sort of danger sometimes that that person gets pigeonholed as being just the person that does that, and sort of excuse their kind of slightly awkward behaviour, but we know we can rely on them for that. And I think there is an interesting sort of dynamic there that actually, as chair, you have to challenge a bit, so that you do create an environment where people are encouraged to input, not just in a particular way.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And you don't say to someone, oh, you're the smarmy one who makes us feel good but hasn't got a clue what they're talking about. Whereas you're quite happy to say, oh, you're the slightly awkward one who's the grit in our oyster who will help us make the right decision even if it's awkward. It's sort of odd, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the case. But we're all humans. But I think I think there's going to be quite a lot of churn, and I think it's worth just talking a little bit about that before we run out of time. And I think I think there are a number of clear reasons why there'll be a lot of churn, and it's happening now. So one is the board that this perfectly composed board you put together for a set of circumstances you envisaged aren't now going to happen. Your strategy might be different. So you might just, from a needs point of view, want a different board from the one that you had, as we went into this year. You may also, and as chair or board member, have realised that some of the people on your board really haven't stepped up, or worse, they've got in the way. They've been more worried about their own positions than the good of the organisation. And thirdly, we've probably all got friends who are saying, boy, this has been way more hard work than I thought it was going to be, and actually I'll meet my commitments, but I don't really want it. And so the opportunity then is quite clear. And I think this might be a sort of 20-25% thing. Who knows? But just as a rough guess, I think those three groups might actually comprise 25% of boards. So there will be churn. And so what do we look for? So I think it's actually a great opportunity to improve diversity, to upskill ourselves in all sorts of ways, and have characteristics that we don't currently have upon our boards. So I think it's quite an opportunity, this churn thing. If there are people from search firms on the call, I'm sure you're sort of salivating at the prospect of this. But I guess you can only salivate if you've got access to candidates that have got those characteristics which we now need and we now want.
And what advice do you offer, Patrick, to people who are reaching out perhaps for their first board role, and are wanting to sort of put themselves forward? What advice do you have?
As with everything, I suppose there's sort of thinking about Venn diagrams again. There's what you're good at, there's what you want to do, and there's what's available. If you think of those three circles, and you're going to have a happy time, you're going to get appointments if what you're good at is what you want to do and it's available, but also you're connected to it. So someone has to know you are good at this. Someone has to know that is really, really what you want to do. You are motivated, and someone has to know that you are available. And traditionally, we've tended to do that through our, physical networking events and things like that. Actually, now is a time where people seem to be more accessible than they've ever been. I find now I can, connect with people on LinkedIn. I can say, wouldn't mind picking your brains for 10 minutes, and no matter how important they are or self-important they are, you will generally get a call. So people are quite accessible. I take a little bit of my time as well to talk to people who are looking for non-execs and just have a chat. And it's interesting the things that people say. So they don't know where to start is the often problem. And I think the programs that the has, that Cranfield have, and others are very good at sort of, you know, helping you with that. Which networks do you need to be in to get a flow? But they usually come from under our nose. They're usually people that we know who didn't know we were looking. We were too embarrassed to say you were looking.
Yeah.
I think clearly at the moment, certain categories of people are in high demand. So if you do have digital strategy skills, if you do help in terms of you know, having turnaround experience or the things that people might actually want at the moment, then you're going to be in a lot more demand, I guess, than some other groups. But it isn't easy, and you know, a lot of people start with something which is a bit smaller, maybe a bit spotty, maybe not quite the thing that they'd ideally set out for, but they gain that experience. And once you've got good non-exec experience, then you're on your way. I would look for boards that have really good chairs, because I think if it's your first appointment, I think learning the art with a chair who's good would be a useful thing to do. Being on a board, as your first board, with a chair who's dysfunctional themselves or is dysfunctional, is going to be hard to learn the job and to make your way. So I don't think it's easy, Ali. I think it's quite hard, actually. But I think if you're clear what you're good at, clear what you want to do, figure out quickly what's available, and connect yourself to those sorts of situations, then you'll get there, because there will be a lot of churn.
I think you make a very interesting point about how easy it is to connect with people at the moment. I've found that myself, that more people are reaching out to me, and I'm probably reaching out to more people in that sort of open-minded way of, you know, 10 minutes, could you just offer me 10 minutes, or I just wanted a bit of a chat about this. And I think that's obviously down to the situation in terms of people not networking physically so much, but actually, so that's a really useful thing, because you can get some really good advice from people. And frankly, if you do get a board position, you're going to be working online and have to get used to doing that induction and getting to know people through technology, that rather than through face to face.
There's two questions I thought were interesting there. One around diversity of thinking. And I think, I mean, another good book at the moment is Matthew Syed's Rebel Ideas. And it's all about, you know, actually diversity is valuable because it will, you know, add to your collective knowledge or inquiry around whatever the particular problem is. I think when you interview non-execs and it's all a bit flat and they've only looked at your website, it's hugely disappointing. When you interview non-execs and they've looked at your competitors' websites, your suppliers' websites, what your regulator's saying, what, you know, they've demonstrating a curiosity and a thinking around the organization, then that's quite uplifting. That's someone you think, actually, they're going to, you know, make us think about things in a different way. So I think, you know, if you're a bit further down the track and you're in interviews, I would think, you know, because the way to get an appointment is, you know, get the opportunity to have an appointment and, you know, convert them. And I think in terms of converting them, you know, demonstrating you've got that curiosity, that, you know, thought provocative gene inside you is a good thing. And, you know, and if you've got the human interface chip as well, then you're away.
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit different to being, well, it is different to being interviewed as an exec, because when you're interviewing an exec, you're obviously looking for people with a particular knowledge and skill set, whereas when you're interviewing for a non-executive director, you're really interested in someone that's got quite a broad thinking, an interest in the business, but can demonstrate, as you say, that curiosity and critical thinking.
Yeah.
And the ability to connect with people, frankly.
Yeah. And then there's another one. What's the one about how do you identify boards with good chairs? It's actually quite, I mean, you know, the better performing organizations probably will have better boards, but not necessarily. And at the moment, all the data's out of date. So looking at who did a great job last year might not help you in that, because, you know, that may have been a good chair for a good time, but may not be such a good chair for a difficult time. Equally, you know, chairs who've just gone into situations that may be really terrific may be inheriting data that's, you know, doesn't look that great. So I think you need to talk to people when you're doing your interviews, you know, talk around, you know, ask the directors, ask the exec, you know, how's the relationship with the chair, you know, how's it work, what's the division of responsibilities between the chair and CEO. You can get a lot from those conversations. There is no kind of poll of top chairs that's published. You've just got to sort of ask around, really.
Yeah, I think again, being curious in the interview process, speaking to a number of different people about how is the board chaired, how inclusive does the board feel, to what extent is the chair accessible, to what's the quality of the relationship between the chair and the exec. All these questions are questions that start to help you form your view on whether it's the sort of chair that you want to work with, because of course chairs, like everyone, vary quite considerably. Patrick, I wanted to ask your view on reviews. So obviously the government is under a lot of pressure to do a review of its performance through the pandemic. And I guess there will be some boards that are thinking about doing a review of how well they've responded to the pandemic. I often think about reviews as being important to do when you can see the consequences of the work that you've done. What's your view on whether the timing is right at the moment, whether it's too soon or the time is right for review?
I think there's also the investment that you make in doing a review properly. So you have to balance the reward and the investment. I think there's a very good case now for already looking at, you know, thinking about the way we've worked together type of review. Are we working together in what we think is the most effective way? I think in terms of are we reviewing the quality of our decisions? In some cases that'll be, you know, you've got plenty of time because you've gone bust to think about that, but that may not be, you know, the group you were thinking about. I think it's probably a bit early to reflect on, you know, have we made the best decisions that we could have made? I think what is useful though is taking that sort of black box type approach and saying, you know, actually, if we think now, maybe things will be a bit calmer over the next few weeks. If we think of the stuff that's gone well for us, and use the words so far, the stuff that's gone badly for us so far, what can we learn from the way we decided that? You might be able to do some of that already. So, you know, how did we get that so wrong? You know, actually that went way better than we thought. Why? I think that's a very good thing. I think a lot of boards are going to be doing a board review in the context of, have we got the right composition? So actually there's a couple of boards, you know, I sort of know where, you know, the chair is saying, you know, I'm really not sure now. And they're saying that in a genuinely honest, not an English way of saying, you know, I'm not sure, which, you know, in English means I'm damn sure. They're saying, you know, I don't know. And so I think there's probably a role for some people to do just a quick litmus test on, you know, does it feel like the right board for what's facing you now type of review.
Okay.
Compliance reviews and all those things, you know, they have a steady stream place, and you now is not a time to be not compliant with your regulator. So, and I think a lot of boards have, you know, you've had to do a hell of a lot of things, and maybe some things have gone on the back burner. So there may be some boards saying, you know, well, can we do a quick review just to make sure we are actually compliant, make sure we haven't forgotten anything in this heat and steam of what we've had to go through the last several months.
Yeah. So in essence, it's a good time now to be thinking about reflecting on the working relationships, the quality of the working relationships, things we've learnt and done so far. I like that, so far, and the composition element, but probably not really quite the right timing to be thinking about consequence. Now, we asked a polling question about a month ago about the relationship between the board and the executive team and how it's changed during the pandemic. And a lot of boards had found their relationships have got a lot closer. I wonder, Leslie, if we could put that poll question up again. It'd just be interesting to see if those statistics have changed much, given that we're now entering perhaps a more difficult phase of companies having to re-engineer themselves and come out of the pandemic. What would you say about the boards that you sit on, Patrick? Is the
I think they've generally got quite closer, warts and all. Is how I'd say it. I think the issue is in terms of that balance between oversight and support, whether that needs adjusting again. So I think the support level became much higher, and there's a point where support becomes intrusion, and you sort of need to step back a bit. But some non-execs have really enjoyed that closer level of support. Management teams have enjoyed having them provide that closer level of support. But you've kind of got to make it balanced. Yeah, so I can't remember what the numbers were the last time, but
last time it was 23, 68, 9. So
okay,
yeah, perhaps
it's maybe a different group of people as well. There may be some overlap, but that might be affecting the result. But crudely, for most people, it's become closer.
Yeah, which is good to hear. And I just was reflecting on that last point you made about support and challenge, and of course that sort of oscillation, being able to oscillate between those two things is such a vital skill, isn't it? And considering the context and thinking quite carefully about how you pay attention to the context, whether you are being more supportive or whether you need to switch to being more challenging.
Yeah, sort of cuddle and kick.
I see Leslie has joined us, so we are running out of time. Leslie.
Thank you so much, Patrick and Ali, for yet again really thought-provoking, excellent advice and wisdom. I think there were a few things that I took out of it myself. I love the content of sometimes single-mindedness is not always a bit inappropriate, and getting this balance of you've got so many different stakeholders and what do they want, and the importance of listening to what they want and hearing rather than just asking a question and ignoring it. The concept of well-being, moving away from risk management and towards maximising performance, I think is really interesting, and I think that will be good to see how that goes on. Being open-minded is obviously very important, but being actively open-minded and actually asking the questions rather than just having stuff coming at you would be great. And then lots and lots of fabulous stuff on board diversity, and having a diverse board is important, but having an inclusive culture is possibly even more important. And then finally, people asking about getting their first role. I think the most important piece of advice that, as a member of the Financial Times Board Director Programme team, I ever give anyone is, if you're looking for a non-executive director role, tell people you're looking for a non-executive director role, because if they don't know you're looking, they're not going to think about you. So thank you so much. Thank you all of you for your great questions, as always, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot, everybody.